So I think I will continue with the Diddy Kong Racing stuff. And, well, since we opened up the topic of superego in the last video, I'm going to see what else can be said about that. Timber, the tiger, is very explicit in the manual as to his fear of his parents finding out that Wizpig has taken over the island and all the trouble that has happened, right? There is this sense, if I remember correctly, that Timber thinks that his parents are going to blame him for what is happening. So what he needs to do is he needs to clear the whole mess before his parents arrive. Right? He says the last line of the plot is that he hopes Diddy Kong doesn't mention any of it to his parents. That's sort of the last line in italics to show kind of almost like the importance of that, as if that is the central issue here. Now, of course, it's weird because, you know, we've seen this plot mechanism before, right? Children are, you know, home alone, terrible things happen, and you need to somehow get the parents to not be aware that it's happening. But what's interesting about these mechanisms is that it's really obvious, in a sense, that a giant wizard pig waking up or sort of visiting from an alien planet and attacking your island or something like that is not something that your parents are going to blame you for. Or you know what I mean? Like, it's obviously symbolic in some way. It's as if all of Timber's attempts to distance himself from what is happening are just projection mechanisms. That is to say, that in fact, everything that is happening now on Timber Island is Timber's own doing, it is his responsibility in some way. And that's why he's so worried about his parents thinking that he's responsible for it. Somehow. There is kind of a weird projection, which of course is funny because it's a projection of a superegoic figure itself, right? If Wizpig represents a paternal figure, and Timber is afraid that his parents are going to get mad at him, then Wizpig already represents an angry paternal figure. You see, so there's a strange kind of accordion-like mirroring here, where Diddy is afraid that the paternal figure is going to get angry when they find out that an angry paternal figure, that is Wizpig, has gotten angry with Timber. So there is like a doubling of the paternal figure over Timber, and Timber finding himself in the middle of it. And presumably Timber himself also doubled in some way, because after all, this is Diddy Kong Racing. And so there is this weird sort of doubling of the protagonists of this story. On the one hand, the protagonist is Timber, because this is his island. It's his problem that Diddy is helping him with. But at the same time, in terms of the themes presented in the plot, Diddy is just as much caught up in it. Because what Diddy is doing, on the other side of the issue, is Diddy is bored with his life on Donkey Kong Island. He's bored of this constant paternal supervision, presumably, and welcomes the trouble in Timber Island, right? Upon receiving this cry for help from Timber, Diddy is actually happy that things have gone wrong. It's almost as if what is happening in the game isn't a problem for the protagonists. Definitely not for Diddy. It's not a problem that he wish hadn't happened. It's a liberation. He's happy that Whizpig is, wreaking havoc on the island. So something is happening with what even the evil here represents, and whether there even is a mission on the part of the good guys to defeat the bad guys. That the lines between that get very blurred. And so, in any case, there is something about time here as well, I think, to add another element into this. And maybe this is a little harder to articulate, but I think this is because of the presence of, TT to begin with. TT, as just the fact that you have a walking stopwatch in the game, of course, in itself, means nothing. It doesn't necessarily imply a greater theme about time. But let me just sort of explain what I mean by that. That there are several, what seem to me to be different kinds of thematic and symbolic associations between elements in this game that point to time in some way. For instance, a somewhat silly one is simply that TT's initials are the same as Timber the Tiger, TT. There may be something there. They even share a certain color scheme in some way, this sort of red and yellow. But even beyond that, there is also this feeling I get that a lot of the levels have something to do with time in some way, or at least more than I would have supposed. Dino Domain has something to do with the past, with prehistory. Dragon Forest is also defined as the manual defines it as an almost medieval area where the last thing you'd expect to see is a team of modern vehicles bursting through. So there is already kind of, the whole thing is constructed in a way where the protagonists driving through these lands are like alien spaceships driving through lands that would not recognize them because of how distant in the past they are. And so, yeah, that's one thing. Of course, I understand that in a sense, you could say that most racing games of this kind, of this sort of cartoonish kind, are set in lands that would represent the past in some way, because, Mario Kart, a lot of these games have levels set in, ancient volcanoes, ancient mountains, the whole theme of ancient sort of landscapes is common to sort of cartoon style racing video games, and probably just cartoon style video games in general, like Mario games and so on. But perhaps there is something of interest in there too. Just the sort of meta fact that the past is such a common setting for these kinds of adventures in video games. You know, how is it that video games rely on the distant past, imaginary lands that evoke a certain kind of a distant past, dinosaurs and so on, as the setting for their adventures? Anyway, so yeah, that's one thing. And then, of course, to kind of offset it, we have a fifth main level in this game, which is clearly futuristic, is very extremely futuristic, right? It even has the name Future in its title. So that, and that is where WizPig comes from. So it's not just that WizPig is an alien who comes from another planet or another dimension. He seems to come from the future, back into the past. And it really contrasts with all this time that our protagonists have spent driving around, you know, areas filled with dinosaurs and kind of archaic, prehistoric type animals, giant octopuses and stuff like that. And it offsets it to this future land where WizPig comes from. WizPig, who is an angry paternal figure, right? But then to tie it together, I would say maybe that the interesting thing is that WizPig is some sort of a magical paternal figure. WizPig is a paternal figure who has been infused or infused with a certain numinosity. And I think maybe that's where one of the key kind of struggles of the game is, in the fact that this numinosity that WizPig has, in some way, is shown to be, I think, a projection of the protagonists. Probably of all the protagonists, not just of Diddy and Timber. And that they are projecting away into the future a numinosity that in fact belongs with them in the present. Right? In another sense, WizPig belongs to the future because he is a paternal figure, and therefore he is older. He exists, he is more grown up, right? He has lived a longer period of time out into the future. I think this may be a strange symbolic way of representing him as a more grown up person, right? In the same way that children think that, you know, when they are adults, when in the future, right, when they have reached that future, when they become adults, you know, they will be an astronaut or they will be this and the other. These kinds of fantasies where adulthood is placed off in the future. That's where WizPig is. Future funland, right? And it's as if all of this fun, this enjoyment, this numinosity is projected off into a structure that is outside of your experience, of your direct experience in the present moment. And so by allowing them to encounter this projection in this magical form of WizPig, they are allowing themselves to kind of integrate that numinosity back into the psyche. That's sort of like maybe a rough outline of what I think is going on. And as I said in the last video, I think that somehow the rigid boundaries between what is masculine and what is feminine are important here. Important in the sense that these are the rigid boundaries that are being dissolved by this process of reintegration of the numinosity, as well as the rigid boundaries, I think, between the future and the past. They're also kind of being explored somehow, thematically. Yeah. And I might as well add, see, that it's interesting to me also that the plot begins with Diddy Kong bored, wishing for some kind of a traumatic event to intrude into his life from the unconscious, and it does. It comes in the form of a message from Timber. That's the first side of the story. The second side of the story begins with Pipsy receiving a message from Taj. So both sides have something to do with the reception of a message. And even the last bit of the first half of the plot involves Crunch and his partner sort of dealing with a superegoic issue of their own, right? Because Crunch seems to be very invested into the paternal authority of Boss, whoever that may be. It could be King K. Rool, it could be some other Kremlin boss in this particular instance of the universe. But he's very invested in serving that authority, whereas his partner isn't. So it's two people. One of them, Crunch, is very determined to follow that authority. The other isn't. In the same way, Timber and Diddy Kong have that same duality. Diddy Kong lives under the paternal authority. Timber is home alone. He has somehow disregarded it, symbolically.